Hello. Hi. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about why I personally like the HHKB keyboards, both for the Topre switches as well as the layout, which will hopefully also shed some light on why I'm using this old HHKB Pro one from 2003 that has a cracked case, which was terribly spray painted by the previous owner 3 times. Later, I'm also going to be covering the Q60 Max, which is a keyboard that imitates the HHKB layout, but is using a metal case, as well as MX-based switches, and has other features such as wireless connectivity. Wow! And also, you may be wondering why I'm wearing this gamer sleeve slash programming sock on my hand, and whether or not it has something to do with the Linux video, but actually, it's because I had to hide the tattoo, which was given to me by a cat. It was given to me by this guy, because I was cleaning his toilet, and he thought I was stealing his toilet, so he gave me this cool tattoo. And then 5 minutes later, he wanted pets again. Also, speaking of tattoos, recently I went to a onsen for pretty much the first time, and it was an onsen in the middle of nowhere. Okay, anyway, as I was saying, what made it special was that they actually allowed tattoos there. There were a bunch of people with like full body tattoos. You know, some people had like massive tigers. It was really interesting. Like, I'm really glad that I was able to witness that in real life as well. Anyway, this video is about keyboards. So as a bit of a backstory, in 2015, I bought my first ever HHKB. Not this one, but it was also a Pro one, but it was from 2004. And after waiting what felt like forever for it to arrive, I remember it looking much smaller in real life than I had anticipated. And I was very excited for it, as I had heard so many good things about Topre switches, and when I tried typing on it for the very first time, it actually felt a bit weird. It was very different compared to the Cherry MX-based switches that I was used to, not to even mention buckling springs, and it didn't really have that quote-unquote mechanical keyboard-like feeling to it. But that's no surprise, considering that compared to most mechanical switches, Topre uses a very different mechanism. Rather than using a spring for resistance and a bump in the plastic stem for ductility, it has sliders on top of rubber domes, and the rubber domes have a lot of resistance at the top, but then abruptly collapse after reaching a certain threshold, giving them a really quote-unquote poppy type of ductility and a resistance curve that just isn't possible with regular springs that have to abide by Hooke's law. This actually makes Topre kind of similar to membrane keyboards, as both of them use rubber domes. However, unlike membrane keyboards, where the dome sits on top of multiple layers of membrane which give them that mushy bottoming out feeling, the domes in a Topre keyboard sit directly on top of the PCB, so when a dome collapses, it crashes straight into the PCB, giving Topre a slightly soft yet distinct, non-mushy bottoming out feeling. Fun fact, before the word thocky became a mandatory buzzword for affiliate marketing, it was pretty much exclusively used for describing Topre keyboards because the impact of bottoming out reverberated throughout the PCB. This was especially the case for the HHKB, where the plastic case mounting of the switches further amplified that phenomenon, which many deemed desirable, and it's also why the HHKB having this plasticky, slightly rattly, sometimes squeaky case is often overlooked. Anyway, the upstroke in Topre switches is a bit more explosive compared to spring-based switches, so overall, a 45-gram Topre switch is going to feel vastly different and generally much more tactile compared to a 45-gram Cherry MX-based switch, and the heavier the domes get, the more tactile they become. The reason MX-based switches can't be as tactile as Topre at lighter weights is already because the tactility in MX-based switches is based on friction against a tactile bump in the stem, and if the tactile bump is too big, with the springs being too light, the switches will start getting stuck on the upstroke. This vastly different construction between Topre and Cherry MX-based switches leads to a completely different typing sensation. If you're used to Cherry MX-based keyboards and suddenly switch to Topre, there is a high chance that at first, it's just going to feel weird, and perhaps even a bit quote-unquote cheap, but let me tell you that once you get used to Topre and you switch back to MX-based switches, you're going to have the exact same experience, but in reverse. If anything, it's going to be a lot more amplified, as a lot of people, after trying Topre, can no longer go back to other mechanical switches. This is because the unique feeling of Topre physically cannot be replicated with MX style switches, which is why Topre ends up becoming the endgame for so many people, and that's pretty much exactly what happened to me as well. Even though Topre did feel a bit foreign at first, the more I started using it, the more I started liking it. But at the time, I was still very curious about other keyboards as well, and I kept my budget to a single keyboard, so I eventually sold my HHKB to buy a Poker 3 on its release, which I ended up regretting. So in 2016, I bought a second-hand HHKB Pro 2 that I even got some PBT spacebars for, but I later still ended up selling it after I finished my hand-wired DIY keyboard project that I was hoping would become my endgame considering its sentimental value. But I still ended up regretting selling it, so in 2018 I found a super good deal on a 2003 HHKB Pro 1, which has been my main daily driver ever since. The reason it was so cheap was first of all because one of the keys wasn't working as it was missing a spring, but also because the previous owner had terribly spray painted the case 3 times. Now, if you don't really know the significance of this, the Pro 1 is kind of a collector's item. I've had multiple people sending me private messages on forums years later, completely out of the blue, asking me if I still have my Pro 1 and if I'd be willing to sell it, and nowadays they're easily going for over $600. To make matters worse, they also painted over the back label, which I scratched off, but turned out that with the paint, I had accidentally scratched off the date information as well, which is pretty sad. I ended up fixing the missing spring by buying a Topre key holder from eBay, where I also took the 90-gram PKA dome from my escape key for the hell of it. But at the end of the day, people prefer different things, so Topre isn't for everyone. Occasionally, even I like to switch things up a bit. For example, a few years ago, I was feeling nostalgic for those OG gaming mechanical keyboards with Cherry MX Blues, and I gotta admit, I kinda did enjoy using those switches again. Moreover, the selection as well as customization potential of genuine Topre keyboards is very limited. In some ways, that can be a good thing because it simplifies the choice. Just pick one that you like and don't think about it anymore, which is great as long as you have an option that you actually like. Personally, other than the HHKB, there actually isn't a single Topre keyboard that I'd like to daily drive because none of them feature a layout that I'd like. To understand why, I'll just explain why I like the HHKB layout. Another fun fact, the HHKB layout was developed by a Japanese Unix programmer who was also a professor at Tokyo University after he became tired of always having to learn new layouts when he had to use different computers, especially since those layouts weren't even optimized for Unix programming. The original HHKB prototypes were a bit different from the final version, and there was even a variant with arrow keys, but it wasn't until 2003 where the first Topre version was released, making my keyboard one of the earliest Topre HHKBs ever manufactured. Now, even though this layout may look a bit intimidating at first, let me just say that there's actually nothing eccentric or scary about it. It's just a well-optimized, compact layout that makes a lot of sense. For example, I personally find it much easier to use than a traditional 60% layout, and it makes sense considering that the traditional 60% is literally just 60% of a full-sized keyboard. It's not directly optimized for its form factor, which leads to certain idiosyncrasies that, I'd argue, make it more difficult to use than the HHKB layout for most people. It's ironic because at some point, the traditional 60% layout managed to become somewhat mainstream, most likely because even though it's a compact layout, it's easier to market than the alternatives due to its more familiar and therefore less intimidating appearance. Nowadays though, the 65% layout seems to be more common, and it's unsurprising considering that it also features arrow keys, which makes it much easier and less intimidating for most people, because the lack of arrow keys is one of the biggest concerns people have when it comes to adopting compact keyboards. And I'll be honest, the main reason I didn't like the Poker 3, which featured the default 60% layout, was because I found the arrow keys hidden under the function layer very painful and unnatural to use even after months of practice, but I never had that issue with the HHKB. Thanks to the better placed function key and the more vertical arrow cluster, the arrow keys are so easy and natural to use, and I barely even need to move my hand to use them, so most of the time, I genuinely prefer them over having a dedicated arrow cluster, and I'm someone who heavily uses the arrow keys for coding and text editing in combination with the text selection shortcuts. The only time I remember being glad over having dedicated arrow keys was back in 2016 when I played this old game called Tomb Raider 2 using my DIY 65% keyboard, because like many games from that era, you have to control your character with the arrow keys. But then I realized that I can just remap movement to WASD. But something else I had on that custom 65% layout were the conveniently placed home and end keys, which jump the cursor to the beginning or the end of a line. I use those keys extensively, so having dedicated keys for them close to the arrow keys was extremely useful, but on the HHKB, they are hidden under the function layer a few keys away from the arrow cluster. Though over time, I've gotten so used to them that I have no issues hitting them whatsoever, but it was a bit hard to get used to at first, because I kept hitting page up and down instead, which are keys that I almost never use, so I wished that their position was in reverse. However, on macOS, instead of the home and end keys, you use the command key, which is basically control on Windows, in combination with the arrow keys to perform the same action. And over time, I realized that I much prefer that over needing to use separate home and end keys, and it also perfectly synergizes with the HHKB layout as well, so I even went as far as to imitate the same key mappings on Windows using PowerToys, but I haven't gotten around to it on Linux yet. Speaking of the control key, on the HHKB, it's located where you'd find caps lock on most keyboards, and if you haven't mapped your caps lock to be control yet, then you should pause the video and remap it right now, because having such a big, conveniently placed key wasted on caps lock is truly a tragedy of the maximum scale. It's literally one of those things that once you try it for even 5 minutes, you'll never want to go back. Instead, you can toggle the caps lock with function plus tab in the case that you'd ever need it. However, in exchange for that, the HHKB is missing a modifier key where the left control would have been. But I find that there is a minor ergonomic benefit to having blank spaces on either side. I can place my fingers on the home row and rest my hands on either side without having to worry about bumping into any of the modifier keys. Moreover, it lets me very easily hit the Windows key with the side of my hand and have all my fingers be free for whatever other shortcuts I might want to use for window management and so on. But of course, you can do this with a more traditional layout as well, and having an extra key on the left can have advantages. For example, you could use it as a duplicate or as some kind of a macro key, but I do find the blank spaces somewhat comfortable to use. I also find that the default backspace location of the HHKB is also objectively better for myself, because I can easily reach the backspace in this position with my pinky finger, but if it were just a little bit farther, I'd need to move my hand or bend my wrist in order to reach it, so I've mapped the backspace there on every keyboard that I've used ever since. And finally, when it comes to the F keys, while I wouldn't necessarily mind having dedicated F keys as long as they're slightly separated from the number keys, I can also get by completely fine without them. In fact, sometimes it's easier just to hit function plus F5 than it would be to move my hand a bit higher to reach the dedicated F5 button. I also wouldn't mind using something like the 65% layout that I designed for myself all those years ago, which is definitely one of my favorite layouts as well, but I don't really miss it when I use the HHKB, yet I occasionally do slightly miss the HHKB when I use that layout. Anyway, now that I've covered the Topre switches and the layout, I'd like to talk about some of the characteristics of the keyboard itself, and I feel like the easiest way to do that is to compare it to the Q60 Max sent to me by Keychron. Now, originally, I wasn't going to accept any further keyboards this year because I wanted to focus on different videos instead, but at the end of my last video, I said that I was curious about whether or not an MX switch-based keyboard that could dethrone the HHKB as my daily driver even exists, upon hearing which, Keychron offered to send me the Q60 Max, which is an MX switch-based modern keyboard that imitates the HHKB. Incidentally, a lot of people in the comments also mentioned the Q60 Max, and while I was somewhat interested in trying it out, I said that it would take me at least 4 months before I'd have time to make a video on it, but they were totally fine with that, so I decided that, okay, I'll review it. And just like with the previous videos, I'm not getting paid for this review, and I chose not to use any affiliate links, and honestly, this time it truly might be the last keyboard review, at least on the main channel, because I really don't want to sacrifice other videos in order to make more reviews right now. So if suddenly every company decides that they aren't going to send me keyboards anymore, that's completely fine by me, as I've been declining dozens of them anyway. The unboxing experience was very similar to that of the Livakivi P1 Pro, so I recommend you go check out that review as well, as I'll be skipping a lot of the duplicate points in this video. This time though, the color matched cable felt a tiny bit softer, and you also get a handy USB Type-C to Type-A converter, as well as some extra keycaps. There's also a bunch of extra foam, which is I assume for making the gasket mounts of this keyboard a bit softer in the case you decide to open up the keyboard and switch them out, and for doing that you also get a screwdriver and an Allen key. And I'm glad that at least keyboards are a piece of tech that you're actually allowed to open up by the manufacturer, and in this case even encouraged. Their site even has the CAD file for the top plate, which is pretty cool because I remember back when I was making my 65% hand-wired keyboard that I contacted the owner of the ortholinear keyboards asking for the CAD file of the neutrino bottom plate so I could cut it out myself because I couldn't find the bottom plate for sale anywhere on the market. My first impression when lifting the keyboard out of the box was once again that it was incredibly heavy. It weighs 1.5 kilos, so it's almost the same weight as the Livakivi P1 Pro, despite being a much smaller keyboard. And the build quality of this keyboard was incredibly good. All the materials felt high quality, the shapes, edges, gaps and so on were perfectly aligned, and there also weren't any signs of cut corners, so I really have zero complaints. I also think the keyboard looks great in terms of the various shapes it has, as well as the overall slightly retro color scheme and aesthetic, which is kind of like an in-between of an HHKB, as well as the original Apple Macintosh keyboard, considering the bezels. Speaking of the bezels, they are obviously much wider than the ones on the actual HHKB, which of course increases the footprint of the keyboard a bit, and I can definitely imagine that some people might find the exaggerated lip a bit less comfortable to use, yet others might see it as a mini wrist rest and even prefer it. Personally, I can't really make up my mind on whether or not I prefer it in terms of comfort, because while occasionally it does feel like it gives extra space where you can rest your hand, if you look at the way the epic paint job of my HHKB has worn down over time, I clearly rest my hands on the edge a lot, which is a bit sharp on the Q60, but overall I wouldn't say that it's such a big deal. The BBT keycaps feature a cherry profile, a very fine grainy texture, and they're also really thick. Though I feel like when looking closely, the die sublimated legends are a bit inconsistent, for example if you compare the font thickness between the C and A keys, but other than that, I think these keycaps are pretty nice. The keyboard is programmable just like the Livakivi P1, so you can watch that video for more details, and you'll probably want to remap the delete key to be backspace instead, and the reason it's like this by default is because that's how it is by default on the HHKB as well, but most people just change it with the dip switches. There is also a Mac/Windows toggle switch, which can be handy, especially since in reality it's just a switch between two profiles that you can configure to be whatever you want. It also features both Bluetooth as well as 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, as well as RGB, which I assume most people are going to keep off considering the design of this keyboard. When it comes to the switches, I chose the Jupyter Bananas, which are a tactile switch that kind of imitate Topre. Of course, since they're MX based, the experience is still going to be absolutely nothing like Topre in reality, but what I mean by that is that they have a tactile bump straight at the top of the key press, which also kinda collapses once it reaches a certain threshold, and I noticed that the switch also seems to rebound a bit more aggressively compared to most other MX-based switches. When typing, you can definitely feel the tactility, but it's more similar to something like Cherry MX Clears, as they aren't anywhere near as over the top as the infamous Box Royals, which ironically are one of my favorite switches. That being said, despite this keyboard being gasket mounted, the bottoming out sensation as well as the sound is definitely very sharp and clacky, which is not a bad thing as a lot of people might prefer that kind of a sensation, and I do kinda like these switches and the overall typing experience. It's satisfying, and while the switches do have some weight to them, typing doesn't take too much effort, and regardless, this keyboard is hot swappable. Though I'd like to warn you that at least with these switches, the board is rather loud. So anyway, after having daily driven this keyboard for around 4 months, is it going to replace the HHKB as my daily driver? Well, I kinda feel like it won't. Even though this keyboard has so much going for it, and despite it technically being objectively superior to the HHKB in almost every way, there were two things that still kinda made me prefer the HHKB. The Topre switches, as well as the weight. Like I've already said so many times, I absolutely love heavy keyboards because the weight makes them feel solid and high quality, which is definitely what this keyboard is, and I don't think that this is something that needs to be changed, but practically speaking, I constantly slightly adjust and slide around my keyboard as I change my posture and whatnot, and sometimes I also move the keyboard out the way completely, which is slightly harder and more annoying to do with the Q60 Max, despite it being wireless. And I really wish that the Pro one was wireless as well, but it's not. So instead, I came up with this middle ground solution of using a USB-C to mini USB converter combined with a magnetic cable, which actually works incredibly well. And it also has the bonus benefit of not creating any additional wear and tear on the USB port. But of course, it's nowhere near as nice as having actual 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, especially since the converter also sticks out like a sore thumb. But then you also have the Topre switches. Even though I've tried so many different MX style ones, and despite still wanting to try out so many more, already out of sheer curiosity and passion, I feel like it's always the same. Although I may enjoy many of the switches, and I do like to change things up a bit from time to time, at the end of the day, I find that most of the time I enjoy Topre more, so I always end up back on this lightweight HHKB, and I think that's completely fine. Though something I realized was that occasionally this HHKB can feel a bit heavy and therefore a bit fatiguing to use. This is most likely because the domes are already over 20 years old, so they most likely become slightly stiffer over time and therefore heavier. Many find this actually very desirable, including myself, because it makes the board more tactile and very satisfying to type on. This is also another reason why the Pro ones are so expensive. In fact, some months ago, I went to a store where I was able to try out some brand new Topre Real Force boards, and I was surprised at how much lighter and less tactile the 45-gram domes felt in them, and it was honestly kind of disappointing. But ironically, now I feel like the keyboard I'm most interested in trying out is some updated HHKB just to see how they compare and whether or not it would actually be easier to type during days where my hands feel tired, but I regardless need to get some work done. Anyway, as for competitors for the Q60 Max, there is the HHKB Studio, which is pretty interesting because it features a Lenovo-style trackpoint and mouse switches, as well as some quote-unquote gesture pads, which potentially might be very useful for me, but I haven't tried it out, so I'm not really sure. I actually have the opportunity to receive a unit for reviewing, but for the time being, at least on the main channel, I'd really like to go back to focusing on different videos, including some progress updates for learning Japanese.